welcome to our fourth chapter of Royal Service. So many of you are enjoying this book, as am I. I'm really excited to share the next few chapters with you, and I almost feel a bit regretful because it's Christmas themed, and I didn't time that very well, did I? We're a bit early. Never mind. You can watch it again at Christmas time because it really does have a lovely Christmassy vibe, or as the royals would say, very cozy. At Christmas, the entire royal family, from the Queen down to the youngest arrival, get together at Windsor Castle. Now, it's interesting because I was saying, I always thought they got together at Sandringham, and a lot of people corrected me in the comments, and you are, of course, correct, because Stephen Barry actually verifies that because the royal family used to be quite large, there was lots of new babies and lots of new marriages, and everyone wanted to get together. They needed Windsor because it was big. A few other people also said that after the Windsor fire, it was permanently sort of shifted to Sandringham. But it was really a space issue because Stephen Barry points out that that makes up a lot of people at that stage. It was a big, big family and it was expanding all the time. Christmas used to be spent at Sandringham, but during the 12 years I worked at the palace, there was a boom in royal babies. The children who had been babies inevitably grew up. Sandringham became too small to house everyone, so now Christmas is spent at Windsor. Now, it's interesting that each branch of the family had their own tower at Windsor. So the Queen's immediate family was, of course, in her tower, in the Queen's Tower. The Queen Mother lives in Lancaster Tower, which is where Ronald Reagan actually stayed when he was at Windsor. The Gloucesters are in York Tower, the Kents in Edward III Tower, and so on and so on. And the staff are in Brunswick Tower. And Stephen Barry was pretty chuffed because he got the most splendid room near the Prince. And he kept that the whole time that he worked as the Prince's manservant. He kept that splendid room at Windsor. So it was rather posh for a member of staff. Most of the staff see little of the royal family as they like to make Christmas very much a family affair. Now, there's three main drawing rooms at Windsor. The white drawing room, which you would be familiar with, a most beautiful room decorated in white and glint and used as a sitting room. The green drawing room with its green silk walls is used for gatherings before dinner. And the red drawing room goes through a complete transformation. Now, I'm going to read you this out verbatim, this next paragraph, because it's so lovely. Okay, here we go. Get in the Christmassy mood. Every piece of furniture is removed and a long, wide trestle table is put down one side. By early afternoon on Christmas Eve, this table is an amazing sight, piled with presents all colourfully wrapped. The table is divided into sections. The first section is piled with gifts of the Queen. Next come the Duke of Edinburgh's, then the Queen Mother's, and so on, down to the youngest royal arrival. The room has red silk wall coverings. The carpets are taken up to reveal polished wood floors. An enormous brightly lit Christmas tree dominates and the chandeliers blaze down onto the bright wrapping papers. The royal family have filled the table 80 feet long with their presents to each other. Isn't that gorgeous? It really just paints such a picture, doesn't it? It would just be so beautiful. I would spend hours wrapping the Prince's gifts, knowing that in the excitement of opening them, all my work would be destroyed in seconds. So in other words, just like any other family. For weeks prior to Christmas, I would have been busy rushing around London or going through Christmas catalogues with the Prince, searching for present ideas for the family who pretty much had everything. It was all much simpler for the Queen. Now this I love, and I think you will love it too. Mr. Knight, who has taken care of the Queen's Christmas shopping for years, brings in a vast selection of expensive and not so expensive gifts, and one of the drawing rooms is turned into a mini Harrods. And the Queen goes shopping every evening after dinner leading up to Christmas, so she can pick out her gifts herself for her family. Wouldn't that be fun? Wouldn't that be just so much fun? You love to have that happen, to have someone come in and bring you a selection of gifts in your grand drawing room and you get to go shopping. Oh, I'll have that one, thank you. I'll have that one, Paul, if Paul Burrell was attending then. If maybe the corgi looking after also extended into working out which presents the Queen was selecting and putting them aside with a name tag. We'll never know. We'll never know. But that just sounds fun to me. And then Stephen Barry said that all the family would ring around each other's pages and say, well, what does she want? Do you know what she wants? So that, Stephen Barry would ring up Princess Anne's page and say, what do you want? And one year he did just that. And he got rather a strange request back. The princess wants a doormat, he said. On this totally reliable information, we actually bought one. And as far as I know, it's still at Gatcombe Park. So she wanted a doormat. It'd be great if the then Prince Charles had got one with a naughty message. That's low. That's very tacky, Shauna. They wouldn't stoop so low. They wouldn't stoop so low. The present opening ceremony takes place on Christmas Eve at tea time. The entire family congregates in the red drawing room and the door is shut firmly. No staff are allowed. And that's when we hear shrieks of delight. Cries of, look what I got, ring out. And eventually the children pound around the castle to try out their new toys or to show them off. So just like any other family. He says the presents tend to be on the practical side, a doormat like Princess Anne got, lamps, a rug, books or ties or a new piece of picnic furniture. I'm guessing the new piece of picnic furniture would have been for Prince Philip. That's what I'm guessing. The reason why, now everyone assumes that they have their Christmas Eve gift opening because of their German heritage, right? Everybody, I assumed that. I bet you did too. Well, no. It takes place due to Queen Alexandra's Day because she was Danish. And Danish people open their presents the night before. So it goes back to Queen Alexandra. So it's not from their German heritage. I'm sure later, it was sort of attributed to that, but it actually goes back to that. Oh, do the Queen's stocking, the Prince would always say. So the then Prince Charles took great delight putting together a little Christmas stocking. Now, the stockings were opened as per tradition on Christmas morning, and they weren't a stocking per se, but they were actually a shooting sock. So a nice big woolly shooting sock would get stuffed with goodies, and Prince Charles used to love to do his mother's, and he used to do a special one for his father as well. So he would do that. And Princess Anne wasn't really into the stocking thing. She used to leave that to other people to do. But quite a few used to make stockings for the Queen. So the Queen would end up with quite a few on Christmas morning, which is cute. Now, they're saying the lunch is totally private when they get back from church, all except for the chef that comes up from the kitchen to carve the turkey. The royals all pull snappers, wear paper hats, eat plum pudding and make a great deal of noise. Now, this is what the staff do, which I found, really interesting. Meanwhile, the staff are having their own marvellous time with a table groaning with food in their quarters. Because I live so near to Windsor, I missed this and went home, but I was always back by 4. So I'd say it would have been sort of like a self-service, silver service buffet on a sideboard, and the family would get up and help themselves, except for, like I said, the chef carving the turkey. The royal family love Christmas. Naturally, they receive hundreds of cards from all over the world. Now, this is sweet. This is really sweet. If you've ever sent a Christmas card to any member of the royal family, you can take for granted that they appreciate it, because listen to this. The prince spends hours pinning all the Christmas cards he receives on a screen in his Windsor sitting room. And the Queen hangs hers on an old-fashioned wooden clothes horse. They think Christmas cards are cosy, a word that rattles through their vocabulary. So anyone who sends the royal a card can bank on it being truly appreciated. Now, that's from Stephen Barry himself. He witnessed it firsthand. So there you go. On December 19, the staff Christmas lunch is held in the palace, and everyone from top to bottom is invited. Afterwards, everyone lines up outside the bow room and files in one at a time to receive a present from the Queen. Now, this ceremony takes an awful long time because there's an awful lot of staff at the palace. So the Queen shakes every hand, says something personal to everyone. It goes on for hours. She must be exhausted at the end. Stephen Barry points that out. But the day is not over because that night she is the hostess for the staff dance, where she is very much in evidence, and the next morning the court moves to Windsor. They are all very fond of Windsor. It's grand and very large, but very comfortable as well. He goes on to say that it's a bit of a joke about all the sort of angst over the civil list every year. And one year, Willie Hamilton, who was an MP, stood up in Parliament and he had the Green Book in his hands. And the Green Book is the royal handbook that lists all the members of the various households. And he very solemnly read out all the names of the women of the bedchamber. Now, he was sort of making out, this is what the taxpayer's paying for, such a waste. How many women of the bedchamber does she actually need? What he didn't realise was that it was an honorary position and no money was exchanging hands except for a little bit of expense money. So they were really friends of the Queen. It was an honorary position. So Stephen Barry said if he wanted to make a really good point, he could have had a go at the staff in the kitchen because at that time there was an awful lot of waste, but they've fixed it in a really practical way. There were 20 kitchen staff, including professional chefs and their helpers, and the waste of food used to be appalling. The Queen gets the blame for this waste and the cost, but in fact it has little to do with her. It was all due to the fact that the staff would be provided for every lunch, every dinner, and often they just wouldn't turn up. So now what happened back then, that to fix all the waste, they introduced a booking system. And you had to book for a meal. And if you didn't book, the meal wasn't made. And, there was ramifications if you booked and didn't turn up. That was the height of bad manners and you were sort of reprimanded for that. So people took this booking system seriously and therefore no waste, because only food was provided that was eaten. Now, they're saying that if anyone turns up unexpectedly, it's very hard to find an extra meal for them because when the Queen is eating alone, they only cook just enough for her. So, for example, they wouldn't do a whole roast for her. They would just do a little chicken portion. So if anyone comes unexpectedly, they've got to rustle up another portion somewhere. The Queen, of course, does have her professional personal maid and dresser and 2 assistant dressers, but he points out the Bobo, the one with the permanent cold, doesn't really do any work anymore, so most of the assistants do the work. Another expense of the palace is the heating bill. The Queen only has to sniff and someone rings and next thing you know, the whole place is heated. So it's actually absolutely stiflingly hot. So he says, though, that everyone who works in the palace has a function and the end result is cosseting the royals. The chefs are there to cook, the footmen and the pages take in the guests and the visiting dignitaries and the housemaids to clean. And on a higher level, the household deal with all the money matters and paying the bills. And he says, I doubt if the Queen has ever signed a cheque in her life. Now, one of the cute stories is the yellow drawing room is set aside for portrait painting because it had windows on each side of the room, so fantastic light for a painter. And the funny thing is that often there was 4 or 5 portraits sort of half done of different members of the royal family, and it's considered quite a regular task of theirs to sit for paintings and portraits. And so Stephen Barry would say, I often remember coming down the corridor at some odd hour of the day to see the Queen in full evening dress, full regalia, tiara, diamonds, sailing down towards the yellow drawing room, the dogs pattering all around her for yet another sitting with an artist. Now, he points out with the jewellery, because he was reminded, talking about the Queen's jewellery, that of course it doesn't belong to any member of the royal family personally. It's always passed down to the next generation. But he did say that out of the Prince and Princess of Wales' actual wedding presents, they do belong to them. But all the jewellery the princess has been given must stay in the royal family forever. So it makes you think about Meghan's earrings. Sorry to bring her up and put a dampener on there, but she did get, given earrings for her wedding. So at some point she might have to return those because the Duchess of Windsor did. Acquired on her marriage to Edward VIII, Much of the jewellery belonged to Queen Alexandra. Now, it's interesting that the Duchess of Windsor did receive pressure to return her jewels because they actually belonged to Queen Alexandra and they had to be returned to the royal family at some point. Lord Mountbatten used to be charged with putting pressure on the Duchess of Windsor up until the point where he was actually assassinated. And he was actually refused admittance in the end because he used to put so much pressure on her to return the jewels to the royal family that her staff wouldn't admit him. And even the Prince of Wales called in for her and had tea while he was in Paris. And Stephen Barry was so upset he wasn't taken because he wanted to meet her and wanted to find out what she was really like. But by this stage, she was very old and frail. But he was there when she came over to the palace for her husband's funeral, for the Duke of Windsor's funeral. The staff were told to prepare one of the guest suites on the first floor at the front of the palace, and when the Duchess arrived, she was so tiny and frail that she aroused a lot of sympathy among the younger royals. And then she goes on to say, you know, the well-worn story that the Queen Mother couldn't stand her and resented her bitterly because she sort of blamed her and her husband, Edward, for the fact that her husband died, you know, so young because of the pressure he was put under during the war, all that. And Stephen Barry goes on to say that any sort of taboo subjects, anything slightly embarrassing, the royal family are very good at just ignoring anything unpleasant. They just won't bring it up. And he brings up the example of Princess Anne's constant speeding fines. She was always fined for speeding. And Princess Margaret's friendship with Roddy Llewellyn, both taboo subjects. Also, Angus Ogilvy actually encountered some trouble when he was working in the city. Now, Stephen Barry doesn't point out what that was, but he said it was highly embarrassing and they never mentioned it. He goes on to say about the Queen Mother's obvious influence over Prince Charles and how much he adored staying with her and how much he loved staying at Birk Hall and Royal Lodge, which could tie into the fact that he resents Prince Andrew being there because it was clearly really a favourite spot for him to stay. And I didn't know this, but the Queen Mother actually threw her own Gillies ball when she was at the Castle of Mey. So that's interesting. And this is really lovely. So they're all on the Royal Yacht Britannia, and this used to be a tradition. And I've heard about this before, but I'll read it out for you because it's so lovely. Every year when we were on the royal yacht, we would anchor for the day off the coast near the Queen Mother's tiny Castle of Mey. The gardens were all made ready by the Queen Mother's gardeners for her August visit, and we arrived in time for a very good lunch. Everyone was encouraged to wander through the grounds before tea was served, and then back to the yacht by launch before sailing on to Aberdeen. Now, this is the delightful bit. As we steamed away, the Queen Mother always sent up big rockets from the turrets of her castle for a dramatic farewell, and her staff would wave big sheets from the battlements. In return, the Britannia would send up flares, scorching streaks of light into the sky. Very dramatic, very exciting. Unfortunately, being Scotland, some summers were rainy and foggy, so you couldn't see the Queen Mother's fireworks, and she couldn't see ours either. But we could all hear the bangs and crashes as they exploded into the damp sky. From July on, the Prince would often say, "I'm exhausted, Stephen. I can't wait to get to Balmoral." After the Castle of Mey, that was our next stop. All right, I'm being very generous. That was a long chapter, but I'm going to do another one. Chapter 8, Mother and Son. During the time I worked for Prince Charles, I couldn't remember a day when, if they were in the same place, he and the Queen did not spend time together. And he goes on to say that whenever the Prince was there and the Queen was there, if they didn't have anything on, they would always dine together. So they were incredibly close. The Prince is very fond of his mother and he still calls her mummy. And he went on to say some really lovely things about the Queen. Well, what Prince Charles actually said to him about the Queen. He said that his mother was very, very wise, and he believes this: the longer the Queen does the job, the better she becomes at it. He says she's brilliant and he values her guidance enormously. So imagine how much he must miss her now. But the speculation that she might abdicate and let the prince take over the throne is absolute nonsense. When this was suggested in the newspapers, he read the report, snorted and said, "What rubbish." So that's another thing that was inaccurate in the Crown. Abdication, the royals say, is not part of the British tradition. It is simple enough for the Dutch monarchy to hand over their throne because they are not crowned in a religious service. Their ceremony is merely a civil one, like Denmark. So the Danes can do that. But kings and queens of England are anointed and consecrated by the church. It is like marrying a nation. Isn't that lovely? That's just so poetic, isn't it? So this is interesting that the Queen is very preoccupied with, preserving the monarchy, passing it down in a fit state. So Stephen Barry says that when the Princess of Wales slipped down some stairs at Sandringham in January 1982 before the birth of William, she was concerned as a grandmother would be, and she called the doctor immediately to make sure that everything was all right. Now, the whole thing about Diana deliberately throwing herself down the stairs has been thoroughly debunked now. And yes, she slipped. So it was all sort of finessed for dramatic effect in Andrew Morton's book. And it's not Andrew Morton's fault. The princess was the one that told him that story. "It's a fine balance," said the prince, "to be modern, but to keep the mystique." Now, the prince also said about his father that the Duke is the most knowledgeable person I know. Now, he goes on to say that it's the Duke of Edinburgh that really is control of the family side of the family. He leaves the royalty, the queening, being monarch, to the Queen, but he's firmly in charge of the family and what goes on with the family. It is the Duke who will storm down to the kitchen to tell the chef he thinks the dinner was bloody awful, and it is he who makes family decisions when the royals are on holiday. He brought up the children strictly and is still inclined to get irritable with the prince. He used to tell him off for being too slow. He'd say, "Charles, do come along." He's always trying to speed him up. And the prince would say, "Coming, Papa." We all thought he was getting very irritable with the prince because he wasn't settling down. However, since the engagement and the wedding, all that seems to have passed. So it does sort of, weigh into that pressure that Prince Charles was feeling. But the Duke has blotted his copybook over the years with both the press and the public with his habit of making unfortunate remarks. I mean, a lot of people find them highly entertaining, offensive, but highly entertaining. But the people are more interested in the Prince and Princess of Wales anyway, says Stephen Barry. And this is sweet. He and the Queen are getting closer as they get older. Now, I don't buy into the perfect younger marriage. I know that the Duke of Edinburgh had a wandering eye. I don't care what anyone says. I'm sorry if that upsets you, but I think there's ample evidence. But it was also how everything ran in those days. No one in royal circles, no one in the aristocracy expected their husband or wife to be completely faithful. I'm sure the Queen was. But no one expected their husband to be completely faithful. It was expected as long as you were discreet. So I think it's very naive that in the height of his sort of virility that people think that he was entirely 100% faithful. However, Stephen Barry is pointing out that as they're getting closer, they're getting, older, they're getting closer. Okay, so there is terrific unity there. Now, they've been married for 33 years at this point, and they called each other darling, and they meant it. They lived together as man and wife in their own apartments, just like millions of other couples, and she would miss him most dreadfully if anything ever happened to him. It's really rather lovely. And I think it really is really rather lovely. And like I said, I think the Queen absolutely adored him. I think the Duke absolutely loved and respected her too. But I think there's ample evidence to suggest that there were just a few dalliances. And I'm sorry, I know I'm going to get canned in the comments for that. But I am convinced of it. The Queen always leaves for her Windsor Castle weekend on a Friday, but it seemed to us that when Harold Wilson was the Prime Minister that he used to like to introduce a bit of intrigue because he got on with the Queen so well. Their audiences used to stretch on, because they used to get on so well. They used to have such a great time together. And often he would duck in to see her on a Friday afternoon. Their official thing was 6:30 on a Tuesday, but often he would duck in on a Friday afternoon to give her a little bit of drama or intrigue just before the weekend. One of those was the fact that the Treasury had decided to devalue the pound. So he popped over to tell her before she went off to Windsor. Prince Charles particularly liked James Callaghan, and Edward Heath was difficult to communicate with. Margaret Thatcher, no one seemed to mention her. She was a bit of a non-entity, apparently. Now, he says a beautiful thing about Jubilee Day, and I've got to read it out verbatim. On Jubilee Day, the staff were allowed the rare treat of lining the corridor to the grand entrance when the Queen left for St Paul's and the service of Thanksgiving. As she came into the grand entrance, which is like a well, so it gave everyone a good view of her, the entire staff just broke into cheers. She stood stock still for a second, looking totally stunned, almost as if she might cry. Then she recovered, smiled and waved at the people who worked for her, and in her marvellous pink outfit, the baubles on her hat jauntily swinging, walked to her carriage. Now, the Prince, of course, was waiting on horseback to ride beside the carriage. The cheering that started at her own front door just grew and grew in volume all the way down the Mall, the Strand, Fleet Street, until she reached St Paul's. It was the most wonderful, wonderful day. We drank champagne at the palace. We toasted the Queen. Many of the girls were in tears. We were stunned by the public emotion, and so was the Queen. But the best day was the Jubilee Day itself, June 23rd, 1977, watching the crowds gather outside from the palace windows and hearing the incessant cheering that went on from early morning to late at night. The Prince turned to me and said, "I can hardly believe it," but he did not know that an even greater tidal wave of affection would sweep over the family 4 years later in July 1981 when he married Lady Diana Spencer. So I'm going to be doing a couple of chapters of this. I'm going to do longer videos once a week rather than 2 shorter videos every Friday night until this book is finished. We're going to be doing it. It's going to be a premiere so we can have live chat 9:30 every Friday. So I look forward to seeing you then. Let me know what you think down below, and let me know what you think about my rather controversial comments about the young Queen and the young Duke of Edinburgh. Okay, I can't wait to read them. Be gentle, be gentle. I'll see you next time. Bye.